Welcome to BLR's Fall Reading, conversations and readings from the newest issue of Bellevue Literary Review. I'm Danielle Ofri, Editor-in-Chief of BLR, and we're celebrating the 47th issue of BLR, which has the theme of Body Politic, examining how our bodies and our health intersect with society around us. And we're so glad you can join us tonight to meet some of the writers in this issue. I'm going to start off interviewing one of our fiction writers, Mehr-Afarin Kohan, who's both a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist joining us from Toronto. And I was so drawn to her story in the slush pile when I first read it that I just really wanted to meet her. But first, we'll start with a short excerpt from her story, The Sounds of Gilitzingo.
Hello, I am Afarin Kohan. I'm reading today from my short story, The Sounds of Gilitzingo. It was somewhere in the mountains of Gilitzingo, Mexico, that my mother raised both arms to the sky and screamed. She screamed like the ravens circling above. She screamed so loud, I thought the dry earth already cracking under my sneakers would gape open, like when earthquakes hit Mexico City or Tehran, both cities built on fault lines. It was a week into our vacation in Mexico, and my father still had not acclimatized to the heat. So we left him napping in the shaded rental car, perhaps dreaming of the snow we left behind in Toronto, and started our hike along a flat, sandy road. The path turned uphills through sharp volcanic rocks, interspersed with fierce, gigantic cacti, then narrowed into rough trail with wilder, overgrown shrubs and spiky flowers that scratched our ankles. The dry wind of Gilitzingo picked up vigor as we climbed higher, whipping my mother's skirt into such a frenzy that it restrained both her legs. To keep herself from falling, she forced one knee out through a gap between the flaps of her skirt and leaped forward. But I still needed to anchor her arm, her skin slipping from my sweaty hands. I had never seen my mother break down. All my life, she was fine. Once we had to wait in line under the smoldering sun for hours, and she kept me under her skirt for shade. She said she was fine, even when my father had to apply Vaseline that night to her burnt shoulders, even when she dove into a lake so freezing that her kidneys ached. She said she was fine. It was October, a Canadian October, and I shrieked when my toes merely skimmed the lake's surface. Seeing her body sink deeper into the blue, I thought she was a mermaid, withering under the sun or shivering in icy waters. She was always fine, unbreakable, until she broke. Arms towards the sky with all the air she had collected in 40 years of walking on Earth, from Iran to Canada to Mexico, passing through deserts and lakes and mountains, she screamed. I could hear all the air exiting her lungs, the hot and cold and dry and humid air. Then she brought her palms together to pray, sinking to the ground. God, why do I deserve this? She pleaded. God, take this bee from inside my head. I'm begging you to let it be silent again. I'd never seen my mother so full of disdain for religion pray to a God she didn't believe in before. When her symptoms first began last year, I imagined the real bee stinging her brain, its buzz resounding inside her skull. When she banged her temples, I waited for a bee to exit from her ear, until my father said a word to me that I needed to look up in my parents' nursing textbooks: tinnitus. Your mother has been through a lot in her life, my father had said to me. Be a good girl to her. So now I'm going to move to a different section of the story, somewhere in the middle. So here there's more information about her relationship with her father that I'm skipping, and also a little bit of a background about where the parents came from. But I'm going to move back to the mother's background again. Emancipated from my boring high school in Thornhill, I was enamored with Mexico. It was full of music and happy people and color. But my mother saw only the ragged and the ugly. Ah, what do you know about the world anyway? She barked at me, contempt gathering in her lips and teeth. But what she hated the most were all the noises. Noises so loud they were hard to hear. Blasts of roadwork, roar of motorbikes, coughs of rusty bus engines, laments of street accordion players, howls of hungry dogs, shrieks of ravens tearing apart stray hatchlings. She dreaded the most the woo of the wind that wailed like a crowd of anguished women and children. It was not easy for me to see my mother on her knees in that way. God is also for desperate people, I suppose. God could be for when tired legs can no longer hold a skirt flapping violently in the wind. I never knew God. So once when I fell from my bike and my wrist was stuck in the direction it's not supposed to ever go, I cried out for my mother, looking up to the sky as if she would descend from the clouds with her arms outstretched and eyes wild with worry. And she did come, not from the sky, but from the end of the street, running with her knees so high I thought she was going to turn into a horse and gallop. I told you to be careful, stupid girl, she barked at me. And then she gathered me in her arms, her voice immediately softening. Oh, my little peanut, it's going to be okay. Look what you did to your poor wrist. She held my wrist in both hands and gasped and neighed and cuffed me lightly at the back of my head. Now her praying to the clouds sounded stupid because I was old enough to know that nothing and no one would ever be descending, and old enough to know something had broken in my mother's backbone forever. So the story continues with information that the grandmother, the mother's mother, has passed away, and that mother did not have the chance to visit her. And that was the beginning of the tinnitus for her. And eventually she returns to their father and they are able to bring the mother back to the car. And so now I'm going to read the last paragraph, the last bit of the story. It was decades later, as she shrank on the hospital bed, skinnier than the dried leaves, when she thought I was her mother, speaking to me in a language that neither my father nor I could understand, that I recalled our Mexico trip. Inflicted with the same amnesia she harbored, I had held on to the fabricated version of her that was now eroding in front of my eyes. It was unmasking a suffering that had crystallized in her inner ears long before my grandmother's death, long before I was born even, longer even than the time she fled her birthplace as a young woman, a decade into the revolution. I hesitated to ask about what the sounds of Gelotzingo had triggered in her. When I did, she stared at me with hollow eyes and babbled like she was sinking into ominous waters. It was as if she was not my mother anymore, and I had not exited from her womb, but from another woman I knew nothing about. This other woman resembled a wet canary in the rain as she tried standing up on the hospital bed despite the nurses pulling her down by her floppy arms. Even when restrained by leather straps, she puffed her chest up, raised her chin, and stretched her neck like she was about to sing her loudest song ever, but no sound ever came out.
Thank you, Afarin. That was really beautiful. And we loved this story. Now, this story is fiction, but does it have any resonance in real life?
So the story is ultimately fictional, but the idea of it actually comes from my relationship with my own daughter. So I have a six-year-old daughter who was born in Toronto and is growing up here, which is a very different experience than where I grew up. So I was born in Tehran, Iran, and I lived there until I was a teenager, and then I moved to Canada with my family at that time. So my childhood and my past is vastly different from what my daughter is experiencing. And I find myself, trying to protect her from what I consider to be a traumatic past for me because of my experiences in what I consider an extremely patriarchal society where I grew up, and it's almost dystopian. Um, and while I see myself as a fairly resilient person, there was a time that I wondered, can I really hide the broken parts of myself from her? And what does she see when she looks at me? So the story was inspired by imagining my daughter as the protagonist, writing about her mother.
That's absolutely fascinating. I had no idea when I read it, but it really does make sense. Our theme for this issue of BLR is body politic, how our bodies and our health intersect with society. And I'm wondering how do these themes reflect in your story?
Actually, body politics shows up quite a bit in my writing, and I would say partly consciously and partly unconsciously. In this particular story, bodies come to bear the scars of the past trauma. What we see in the tinnitus, for example. But they also communicate the trauma in a silent form to the next generation. So specifically in this case, from the mother to the daughter. So while the language cannot bear to articulate the pain, the body carries it and communicates it. But also in this story, the bodies are also passing on the resilience and the perseverance.
Your day job is as a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst. And so, can you talk a little bit about how society and the greater world intersects with the bodies and health of those you care for?
If I wear my psychoanalyst hat for a moment, I would say that our bodies are the first points of contact with the other and the collective. And this interaction is bidirectional. So our bodies are the boundaries of what we experience as our individual self. And we might say that our body carries the whole host of our experiences, whether it's in the forms of emotions or memory or bodily pain, etc., or what we do to our bodies and things like that. And in that sense, it carries us and our history. But it is a permeable barrier in contact with the world. And so while it takes from the world, it also puts something out in the world that determines our interactions with the others. Say, for example, through the color of our skin or the size of our body and so on. And then that again comes to impact how we experience ourselves. So there's this constant back and forth. So the body bears the memories and the scars, but the body can also be a battleground. And that is something that I'm very familiar with through my own lived experiences as well. Bodies become battlegrounds when they're either invisible to the world or mistreated by the world through discrimination, for example, or control. I believe that one important way of controlling a person is through physically controlling their body, and that is accomplished through various means. It could be discipline, labor, but also what they're forced to wear and not to wear, and so on. So when the body is violated or restrained or oppressed, the subject struggles to maintain its agency and subjectivity. And that is something that we see in trauma and gender-based violence, as well as systemic oppression and so on. And these are all the kinds of things that I see in my line of work and I deal with all the time. So the body is implicated in many different ways.
Body politic is also the sense of the collective, and dislocation from the collective has a profound effect on people's bodies. And it's also a powerful theme in literature. I think of writers like Jhumpa Lahiri, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's a whole kind of culture of writing about dislocation and body politic. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how this collective sense maybe plays a role in your writing or in your work.
Dislocation from the collective and how it is carried in the body or how the body comes to represent it definitely shows up in my writing. But I would say it differs in a crucial way from, for example, a writer like Jhumpa Lahiri, in that Lahiri has an affinity for her Bengali heritage, despite displacements and distances, and is still accessible to her, both physically and mentally. While I find myself in a state of complete detachment, actually, from my place of origin, because that space is not accessible anymore. Sometimes there's a sense that something has died, that's not retrievable. Maybe in the same way that the mother in this story cannot visit the grave of her own mother. Like the place of origin, the birthplace is forever destroyed, and it is not possible to be visited any longer. So that, I think, is the flavor that carries through a lot of my writing. And in my stories, this shows up as anorexia, dementia, kind of wasting away because the motherland cannot feed the body. And at the end of this story, that's why I wanted to read the ending, because we see this at the end with the mother, and how she's wasting away, and then how it's actually carried forward to the next generation. So that starvation is carried forward to the daughter, or the amnesia is carried forward to the daughter, where there's also something that she feels like has died or is dying.
Wow, those are powerful metaphors, or really embodiments. I think it's fascinating. I'd like to turn a little bit to craft right now. I'm always interested in writing craft, and you and I did some very intense editing with this story, and I'm wondering if you'd be amenable to sharing what was it like to have your creative work, presumably that you sweated over for years, now intersecting with some random editor's creative vision.
Yeah, we did some intense editing. It is always a challenge because I'm very dedicated to the sounds of the language, and I'm particular, like I'm sure many writers are. But the editing process is also interesting because it is a bit like having a dialogue. And it's interesting to me when something that I take for granted comes to be not so obvious to others. And especially when when we're speaking from different places, or we're talking about a different society, different background, which in my work is definitely there. It is actually very helpful when an editor shares something that they're confused about, or ask a question, or ask for elaborations, because it helps me see how my work is seen through the eyes of the other, and it actually helps me see something that maybe to me I'm just blinded to it. It's my blind spot, because to me it's obvious and to somebody else is not.
Thank you so much for going through this process. And lastly, what's next for you? What's on deck literarily?
I am actually working on a collection, and I have published some pieces of that collection, and this is going to be one of them. And this collection is a collection of short stories, and it's a bit of a collage that put together paints a picture, not a complete picture, but fragmented picture of my experiences growing up in Iran, and then the process and the immigration and displacements, and also a lot of politics. Iranian society is a political society. There's a lot that's going on there, and reflecting some of that, and especially the recent movements in Iran, with the women's rights movements in Iran, are reflected in that.
Well, we'll be very excited to read that collection. Thank you so much for sharing your time as well as your beautiful story with us.
Thank you very much, Danielle. It was a pleasure talking to you as well.
We now turn to poetry. Sean Sam is a member of the Navajo Nation and an MFA candidate at Cornell University, where he won the George Harmon Cox Fiction Prize. He'll read from his poem, Letter from a Code Talker, 1945, and then be interviewed by assistant poetry editor Saleem Hue Penny.
Letter from a Code Talker, 1945. The enemy's skin seems a similar shade, sometimes glowing in atolls bombed, or when it flaps and droops like a flag, a flayed skull in howitzer flashes. Mouth gaped, slack as the jaw of a monitor lizard smiling, the grammar a grinding teeth, my saliva a code, more sensual than enigma, all vibrating hyoids. Speaking so well and existing so native, Uncle Sam has granted me a guard. Brown skin of suspicion. It is to patum lucidum at twilight. So surely the sun-baked corpses reek of misgivings, and the murky modern transport trails called territory are on trial. If only the hell passes, and my voice again joins the gentle talk of yours beside hoodoo spires, never again stuttering through bunkers. My dialect is death distorted. Everything I am belongs to the bombs. The commanders wish me to say the language beaten from me. Each time I speak, another sun drops from the abnormal sky. I only desire at least one other to see this endless loss and let my words escape into their time. So what if I was not here, but there, gone yet living within this lacuna, wandering between letters? Let me speak.
Thank you so much, Sean. I am so excited to get to speak with you. My name is Saleem Hue Penny, pronouns are he, him, and friend, and I am one of the assistant editors on the BLR poetry team. This poem, it's such the joy of being an editor, you know, when a poem comes through your submittable stack and the title gets you, and then by the end of the first stanza, you're like, okay, I need to print this out. I need to sit back with this poem. And this is definitely one of those pieces. So I wanted to start by asking you just kind of broadly some of your process as you were going through writing this. And I know it went through different iterations and different drafts, and would kind of just love to hear a little bit about the process of crafting this piece.
Yeah, you know, I'm Navajo, a member of the Navajo tribe, and this subject was always of interest to me. And I didn't really want to write a story about it. I wanted to do more of a poem because I could be more abstract and talk about, I guess, sort of war in general, especially language too, because poetry I think is really good for talking about language. And yeah, I mean, it went through a couple different versions that you helped a lot to get it to where it is now. So thank you for that. But yeah, it was, it's been around for a while. I've been working on this one for some time, and I think it finally came together in a way that I'm happy with.
Absolutely. And I love that sometimes there's this mystique that poets just sit down in one go and it comes out.
Mm.
And I love you can tell this is a poem that has struggle in it. So I would assume an author might naturally have to go through some struggle as they're writing it. So I really appreciate that. I just want to point out a couple lines that really hit me and see if we could get a little bit into it. So right off the top, the enemy's skin seems a similar shade, right?
Mm.
And we fast forward a couple stanzas later, and we have speaking so well and existing so native. I think when I first talked to you, I was like, that was one of those mic drop moments in this poem for me. I'm really curious about shade, about color, about culture, and sort of how this shows up in this piece for you.
Yeah, I think I was trying to keep it a little grounded in the history, I guess, in the sense that when they did get these code talkers, they were, you know, Native American, and they're not white, and they have a skin color that's, I mean, you could say similar to a Japanese person, but not exactly the same, but certainly not white. And they could even be mistaken for Japanese at times, especially from a distance. And so they gave them these special guards to protect them because this code was so important. But they still were not like fully accepted as being, you know, white in society, in the larger society, even though they were doing this really important job. And then when it comes to the poem, I thought, well, that might be an interesting way to start it because it's all about the way this person feels about how they are now and how they were treated in the past as a people and sort of otherness of their skin, even though they're talking about something grotesque like death. And then, of course, in death, like we're all kind of the same, right? So I thought that would be like an interesting image to start with, like really striking way to begin it.
Yeah, I mean, it was absolutely masterfully crafted. And for me as a reader, to have a line like that right off the bat of the enemy skin seems a similar shade. As with most poetry that I'm drawn to, I'm able to situate multiple people in the speaker, role. And so immediately I'm thinking like the enemy skin, like, and I'm thinking my shade, and then I'm thinking what are similar shades, and I'm thinking colorism, and it's amazing when you can kind of find yourself in a piece. So I really want to thank you for that. Also, having history and sort of docupoetics is something we don't always get, and I'm so glad that we're a journal that excels in kind of medical humanities and really thinking about the body. And I just think you approached it in a fresh way, where the medical, some of the literal medical language, and I had to have some Googling of myself to be like, okay, oh wow, we're talking about some eyes, and we're talking about parts of the eye that I didn't know about, and we're talking about spaces between joints, and so I love that you still stayed very consistent with what the readers of this journal love to be challenged intellectually as well. So I appreciate that. I wanted to zoom out a bit. I know that you are an accomplished writer across genres, and wanted to speak a little bit about the role of narrative. At the beginning, you specifically said, I didn't want this to be a story. I wanted it to be a poem. So even there, it's automatically showing people that part of the job of a writer is figuring out which form this piece, this story, is calling for. So I'm really curious, just how do you think about narrative? How do you know what a piece needs to be?
I think at this time I'm really like so focused on fiction that I have to admit, even back when I wrote this, I was still like, I couldn't get away from narrative. You know what I mean? There are some poets who are like fully language based and the story is not really there. For me, it's like I always think about story. I always think about especially point of view, which is like always my in to talk about fiction or poetry. Really, like in poetry, usually there's always debate about who's the speaker. Is it the writer, or is it the person who's in the poem? And for me,
who's the I?
Yeah, for me, I always it was always easier for me to say, oh, there's definitely a speaker, because I always would like try to go into somebody else's mind the way that you can do in fiction. So once I have a point of view, like I'll let that like color the language and everything else and the way of thinking about the world. And I hope that comes from this poem, that this person is doing this stuff. But even though there's like some colloquial stuff in here that's kind of in violation of point of view, like existing so native is kind of a it's kind of a winking line, but I like it. And it's not meant to be 100% in that person's mind exactly. It's kind of floating in between, especially towards the end where it gets a little strange with the talking about sort of time being here and being there. So I would say this is in poetry, I play more with point of view than I do in fiction, where I tend to be very consistent with like the person's thoughts, mind, like everything's filtered through that.
Wow. That's a really nice distinction, and being able to, I think even the structure of this poem being in, kind of tercet, quatrain, like there even is some seeing the words on the page is even sort of cueing me that this is not going to move in this paragraph way. A lot of the line breaks sort of make me pause and then jump back. And I feel like time travel, I'm obsessed with time travel, and seeing 1945 and, being like, wow, what has changed since 1945, to 2024, 2025 was also a really humbling, sort of moment of reflection. Who are the others, right? Who is actually allowed to speak? Who are we speaking for? Which brings me to one more point I wanted to touch on, which is storytelling. And do you have a history of storytelling? Where some of the stories that have impacted you, where have those stories come from?
Well, I mean, I think that my background, the whole like the novel are very like, well, every Native American tribe really is very oral based storytelling. And for me, like I wanted to do this type of poem in a way that would be still respectful, even though if it was kind of playful and kind of arresting, but do it in a way that I feel like I could talk about it and make it seem like, this is still happening now. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so for storytelling, I've tried to absorb the rules, I guess, of Western storytelling. But wherever possible, like I will do something different. Like if I can be more playful, or I can break a rule, or I can, and I honestly think a lot of the best writing today is works in translation.
Yeah.
Because they're not absorbing those rules necessarily, and haven't, like, even the way they're breaking them is not necessarily the same as the way I would break the rule, because I'm already sort of like tainted by that canon-ish stuff,
Right.
So I look for works in translation now if I want to see something that's really different, because they've absorbed none of that stuff and done something like totally different, and it's really interesting. And so yeah, for me, like storytelling, I'm happy it's becoming a global thing, in the sense that I can get access to it.
Absolutely. It'd be fascinating to see this poem, interpreted, translated in DNA, or to have it go back and forth into other languages too. Already talking about translations and codes. That would be fascinating to see how somebody else might translate it. So maybe that's a challenge to an aspiring translator out there. Thank you so much. The final line is a perfect one to leave us with. Let me speak. And thank you for speaking to and with us today. Honored to have you be in the pages and in the space of the BLR community. Thanks so much for your time. And again, congratulations on an incredible piece.
Thank you. Thank you for everything. Really appreciate it.
We'll now turn to nonfiction. Laura LeMoon is a former sex worker, trafficking survivor, and activist, and now a prolific writer. She'll read to us from her personal essay, No One Thing, and then be interviewed by assistant nonfiction editor Alanna Weissman.
I left 12 years ago, but his cruelty still lives in my bones. My body remembers the crushed glass lying on the floor like a memorial, and the seemingly ordinary door that I would walk through to another life, and in many ways to the same life in a different shade. No one thing is any one thing, my mom often told me when I was growing up. When I go to the airport, any airport, it's the thing that slows my heart to a congealed mass. It's the thing that sends me reeling back in time through the black hole of grief. It catapults me to former selves and former lives I never wanted to meet again. But I also refuse to let this hold me back from my future. In an Uber, as I glide past the black and white sign welcoming me to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, my stomach involutes into a sinkhole. With each heartbeat, I hear a voice, maybe my own, maybe someone else's, repeating, "You're going to die today. You're going to die." It never truly dissipates until I am safely at my destination. What I left still haunts me. It was 2012 in a dark room with air thick like unflavored gelatin. It was no particular day in 2012 because it was every day. We had no money, my love and I, so we lived in the basement of someone's house in a town I didn't know the name of, at an address that was also unknown to me. He'd picked me up from a San Francisco domestic violence shelter where I had been staying for a month since I ran away from him the first time. I'm not from California, so all I knew is that we went north on the freeway. In our home, wherever it was, the only light was from the black Baphomet prayer candle that burned day and night, casting shadows on the dank walls. I didn't know what else to do, so I sucked down a bottle of vodka straight from the container. I waded in a pool of my own blood, in a pool of my warm drunkenness, for my love to come back home. I waited for him in more ways than one. I needed a syrupy word or even just a hand that wasn't cruel. What I got instead was battle. What I got was sex that reduced me to ashes and the constant reminder that he was going to eat my flesh and hurl my bones into an empty field, with the caveat that no one would ever miss me. He pointed out which field when we passed it in his truck, and the wildflowers there reminded me of my childhood home. My mom had told me once that she loves airports because she likes to imagine she could go anywhere in the world. I've hated them since I started running away. Domestic violence, homelessness. The only time in recent memory I've been to airports is to run toward or away from bad men. The second and final time I left my love in 2012, I told him my father had a heart attack and I needed to fly home to make things right with him. There were no Ubers at the time. The town was too rural for buses. For a taxi, I would have had to give a pickup address, which I didn't know. So I lied. I was so drunk when his truck pulled up to Oakland International Airport, I couldn't see his face clearly except for his eyes. The same eyes that he'd looked at me with when we first met, like we'd already spent a lifetime together. That looked at me like I never needed to worry about not being chosen ever again. Before I got out of his truck at the terminal, he grabbed my hands with tears in his eyes because he knew. I know that now. It's amazing the glimmers of acknowledgement shit men show you when they know they've been shit. You're not going to leave me, he pleaded, are you? The first time it happened, 2 years earlier, I was in his bed, pushing him away and yelling no. Once he was done, he tried to hold me tenderly. He said he was sorry in a hushed tone that was both fire and salve. He held me with his eyes that terrorized me, but also made me feel seen, for maybe the first time in my life. The things I've had to do to survive were part of the price I paid to be seen. Just being here today has come at a cost I won't explain to you. Freedom in one moment became bondage in the next. Chains exploded into power. No one thing is any one thing. After I left San Francisco, I was hooking regularly to survive and failing miserably at the survival part. But the thing about the sex industry is that agency and empowerment can exist side by side with exploitation and violence, sort of like relationships with men. Sex work isn't bad a lot of the time. Sometimes it's even fun. No one thing. Although I have experienced everything you can imagine in the sex industry, from violence to sexual exaltation, I've never been raped or beaten or betrayed as much as I have by the men who were supposed to love and protect me. One night after my love had strangled me for the first time, I started gathering all my clothes in a suitcase. He cried and reached out and grabbed my hands to hold them and told me with tears streaming down his face that this had always been his problem. I cried too with my hands in his, victim and perpetrator, but also just two flawed people in love. The sweetness he brought to me after the dark times sustained me through the turbulence. They also bonded me to him with a kind of sick hope. Holding complexity is the thing we don't do, but need to.
So thank you so much for sharing that incredible piece with us. You've done a lot of writing about your experiences in sex work, but typically that has appeared in more traditionally journalistic outlets. So can you tell me a little bit about how you approached writing more of a creative nonfiction piece?
Yeah, well, a lot of my journalistic pieces have like a personal essay element in them. So I don't think the concept was too foreign. It was more just like expanding upon the things that maybe I had already kind of briefly or vaguely touched on in more journalistic pieces, which actually felt really good to be able to do that and just kind of open up those times in my life.
So you talk in your piece about the idea of holding complexity, and I was wondering how you approach that in your writing in terms of balancing the coexisting topics like love and abuse without romanticizing anything that we wouldn't want to.
One of the things that made it the most difficult for me to leave that situation of domestic violence was that it wasn't all bad. And I think there's sort of a conception that, people who are in abusive relationships are stupid because, why would you accept that kind of treatment? But it's really not that treatment all the time. And there's this cycle of like abuse and then the honeymoon period, I guess you would call it, where maybe the abuser is trying to make up for the behavior and make sure that they kind of reel the victim or survivor back in, after a period of abuse. So it really isn't all just one thing. And I think that's sort of the gray area or the complexity that we look over when we talk about intimate partner violence.
Building on that, can you talk a little bit more about the idea of no one thing, which became and eventually became the title of a piece and a recurring motif that developed over the course of editing?
One of the big inspirations, besides that particular relationship in which I experienced DV, was also my times in the sex industry. And I think kind of similarly to DV, there's sort of a perception that work in the sex industry is all one thing. And that one thing is usually like negative, exploitative, destructive. And I myself identify as a sex trafficking survivor and a sex worker. So there's like a trajectory of choice that I think, which is a complexity, which doesn't get talked about a lot. And also that it's not like either or, it's not sex trafficking victim or sex worker. There are, most people I know who've been in the sex industry have experiences with exploitation, along with experiences with feeling empowered and having bodily autonomy and all those things.
So building off of that, can you discuss where this piece fits in with the theme of this issue, which is about body politic, as well as your broader body of work and BLR's themes of health, healing, and the body?
Yeah, so those are kind of central themes just because of the nature of being a trauma survivor, childhood abuse survivor, in adulthood, DV survivor, sex trafficking. So to me, like one of the most central issues, I think, and actually I'm writing a memoir right now, and this writing the manuscript has kind of made me realize that like advocating against sexual shame has been kind of a key theme or thread in all of my work. I think shame is also a really important aspect to my writing. And I think I do address it in this piece, especially with the times in which sex work felt more exploitative to me, or I didn't feel like I had, because of my economic situation, I didn't have the proper agency really to be able to choose like who I worked with, to be able to say no to XYZ price. But it also was something that I could do, the survival sex work, that was helpful to my mental health, because I'm also someone living with bipolar 1 disorder. And it allowed me to be my own boss. It allowed me to have some degree of control over when I worked, some degree of control over who I worked with, things like that. So I think that's where the no one thing comes in, is like work in the sex industry has been so many things to me at so many different times. And it's treated politically as if it's all just in this box of exploitation. And that's all it is. So I think this work really fits in with this issue because it's all about bodily autonomy and kind of navigating my own agency within my body, and also as like a deeply political body, which so many underserved communities, are or inhabit. I'm also in recovery. So my journey of recovery and how that journey kind of ties into discovering my body and sort of intersecting also with sex work. And then because 9 years ago, when I got sober for this like last time, because it was kind of a journey my whole life of trying to get sober, was when I started writing. And so for me, like that healing act or healing journey was what really allowed me to be on this trajectory of discovering being a writer and really being political about the body and political about sexual shame and sex work and being a sex workers' rights activist, basically.
You've mentioned mental illness, you've mentioned recovery, you've mentioned sex work and DV, and these are all different but interrelated topics. So how do you approach weaving these things together, and how do they interplay in your work?
I'm very conscious of not playing into stereotypes, like most prominently with writing about addiction or writing about sex work. I don't want to pigeonhole myself. So one kind of landmine that I'm always trying to sidestep is giving people the idea or reinforcing the idea that sex work is exploitative. Like even when I'm talking about, yes, it can be exploitative, you know, but the complexity and there's all these other things. And just for simplicity's sake, I think that people tend to gravitate to the most like convenient, simple explanation for things, which I think is just a basic human thing that we do. So I try to, one, like not generalize, especially when I'm writing about my struggle with addiction and alcoholism, because I believe in harm reduction. I don't try to push like certain programs or anything on other people, but I try to write my experience as authentically as I can while still respecting other people's experiences, because they're all varied, you know, like there are certain things, just even if you haven't done drugs or you don't identify as an addict or any of those things, like I still want to bring basic universality, whatever the word would be, to certain human experiences, like feelings of failure, grief, loss, beating yourself up because you made mistakes or things like that are universal. So I think those are the devices that I try to bring to my writing to make it as authentic to me as I can.
Speaking of literary techniques, can you talk a little bit about how the focus of the piece shifted over time during the process of editing?
I love the process of how it kind of developed and went from one thing that it needed to be at one time to like another
thing.
Yeah, that it really needed to be. It's kind of like a child growing up or something. So originally I was kind of trying to capture the desperation of survival and trying to capture feelings of failure that I left this relationship in 2012, which was violent and destructive. And then I went on to what I felt like was be a failure. And not because I was in the sex industry, but because like I was constantly getting eviction notices. I was homeless. I had no money. I couldn't eat, all these things. And it's like, why did I leave? You know, I had a place to live. You know, I had money to pay for food and things like that. Why did I do that? And then like, to me, there was an inherent promise, and I don't even know where this came from, maybe just society, but there was a promise in leaving this bad relationship that, okay, if you do the right thing, you're going to get rewarded, you know? And like, if you leave this bad relationship, like the universe will make a way for you and things will be easy. And they weren't. And I felt really angry and resentful of that I was like, I went from being exploited in one way to feeling exploited in just another way. And then it kind of went to, which I think is not like a totally opposing concept of like the complexity of all these issues, which sort of was, I feel like, another really important concept to me. It was just something different. You know, it's like you can write about a lot of the same experiences in different ways and have them be different pieces, and they're all really important and relevant to you. So,
what do you hope readers will take away from your piece?
Firstly, I write for myself in my own healing, and of course, I hope other people get something out of it too. Secondarily, I write for other people who are survivors of trauma in whatever form that takes. And I hope that in my writing, they can feel seen and they can feel like validated in their feelings and their experiences.
And I can say I had a great time editing you as well and working on this piece. So we're very thankful to have it at BLR.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Alanna. That was just wonderful. How our bodies and our health interact with society is a complex relationship and often fraught. The call for submissions for Body Politic brought in an immense range of writing, and we're so proud to present them here in BLR issue 47. If you haven't gotten your copy, you can get one now at blreview.org. Better yet, become a subscriber and get this cornucopia of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry delivered right to your doorstep, your actual doorstep or your digital one. Thank you so much to all of the authors, editors for sharing your time, your writing, your thoughts, and a very special thank you to you, our audience, for making this a special gathering. We'll see you all at the next event.